housing is the single most important issue on voters' minds in Colorado this cycle. Housing costs are increasing. Our supply is dangerously low. The statistic that we like to point to on this is that there were 40% fewer units developed across the state from 2010 to 2020 than were developed in 2000 to 2010. So essentially, as our Colorado population has increased, our development has decreased significantly, which is a major reason we find ourselves in this lack of affordable housing and lack of attainable housing. And as we said, this is a deeply important issue for folks across the aisle, from all across the state, from Denver Metro to the Eastern Plains to mountain resort communities to the Western Slope. Folks are thinking about housing. Our polling is seeing about 88% of Coloradans identifying this issue as a extremely serious problem. When we talk about where we're going at this rate and the reason for the measure to pass and why we need to act now is when we look at home prices, if they continue to rise as they have, a median single family home by 2032 in 10 years will cost a Coloradan $1.7 million. That's a median single family home. To qualify for that mortgage, folks would have to bring in nearly $400,000 a year in order to afford that median single family home. And then, maybe folks can't buy, and you look, okay, maybe the rental market is going to shape up to be a little bit better. The fact is, for folks to afford an median rent in Colorado in 10 years, we're estimating that folks would have to make $106,000 each year in order to afford that median unit. So what we're seeing is that this housing crisis doesn't just affect folks who are looking to buy, it's affecting all scopes of life, all folks who are either looking to rent near their workplace, buy a home for their family, or simply looking to live and work in the same community. What Make Colorado Affordable intends to do is take 0.1% of the taxable income across the state without increasing taxes and apply that to affordable housing projects. We hope that, or we estimate that 0.1% is about $300 million. That $300 million enables us to incentivize the development of about 10,000 units each year. And so what we're estimating is through that development of about 10,000 units, by 2040, we will be able to essentially close the gap that currently exists in the affordable housing market. So we're looking to hopefully by 2040 to develop up to 170,000 new affordable housing units across the state of Colorado. As we said, this is not a tax increase, it's a stable revenue stream for a project like this. We will take $300 million approximately a year from the general fund and then debruce that from the Tabor revenues. And so we'll lower that Tabor cap. The impact is that some folks will receive slightly less Tabor refunds, but it allows us to provide this sustainable source of funding without increasing Colorado's taxes. When we look at this measure and look at the current revenues that the state is experiencing, we expect that $300 million a year will be less than 10% of the projected refunds for the next fiscal year. So what that means is folks will continue to receive Tabor refunds in our estimation, but they will receive slightly less in the name of investing in affordable housing across the state, which we feel like really benefits everyone in Colorado. One thing we're going to require local communities to do, because in this measure, it will be the local municipalities in tradition of Colorado and local governance. Local communities, counties, municipalities will be the ones who have the opportunity to designate the projects they want to apply for these funds. in order for those projects to be eligible, two things will need to be true in the counties. Number one is that they will have to increase their affordable housing stock by 3% each year. This doesn't mean that projects need to be completed within the year to be included in that stock, but it does need to be new permitted projects or new projects that are in development. And then the second piece is that local governments or county governments will have to create a prioritized review process for these affordable housing developments. What this ensures is that these projects will take priority in the review. They won't get stuck in the bureaucracy, that we have a clear process that ensures these projects will be approved or will be reviewed and sent back to developers to make sure they continue very quickly and don't get stuck kind of, again, in the bog of the permitting, zoning, approval processes. The great thing about this measure as well is the measure includes funds. The measure includes funds for communities or counties to expand their capacity to create this prioritized review. So if communities are concerned about their ability to institute that, there are funds set aside in this measure to build out that capacity, whether it's hiring more folks or gathering more resources for those review boards or those counties. In terms of where the money goes, there are a few different buckets, but there are two main pathways. So with the $300 million, 40% of the funds will go to the Division of Housing and 60% of the funds will go to CHAFA. What we see from the 40% of funds, some of those funds, about a little less than half, will go to programs that assist folks experiencing homelessness. And then the the rest of that funding will go to down payment assistance programs and pathways for home ownership for first-time home buyers. So the Division of Housing kind of helps us with the bookends of the housing crisis, from folks experiencing homelessness to pathways to home ownership. The middle, the meat of the measure, and 60% of the funding goes to CHAFA, and those CHAFA funds are designated specifically for land banking and for workforce housing development. And there are a number of workforce housing development funding streams that this measure creates and uses the area and median income of communities at the county level to kind of determine what affordable housing looks like in each of those counties. And then depending on the funding mechanism that the developer may be using, we can see the percent of AMI for the affordable housing developments go from an average of about 60 or an average of 60% AMI all the way up to an average of 90% AMI. So what we expect is that we will have a lot of mixed income communities from this measure, which we think is actually a really, really terrific thing. A lot of studies are showing the benefits both from folks bringing in higher wages and folks bringing in lower wages. Having the ability to live together in the same space creates all sorts of really positive outcomes, not just for those adults, but for their children as well. And then when we look at kind of the politics of this, we're fortunate to have kind of a broad coalition of folks who have already signed on, including all of y'all. And our polling is currently at about 58%, but we found that it continues to rise amongst many demographics when we have the opportunity to present the measure in forums such as this. And so we're setting up a new poll that will probably launch at the end of September or early October that will give us a better read on where we stand currently. But then in terms of our endorsement list, it's grown to be quite extensive, over 125 names of organizations, companies, nonprofits, and state elected officials. And we're really, really proud of those developments. One that we got this week was the Colorado Nurses Association, which we see as a really key group as well. And again, yeah, we've seen bipartisan support at the local level, particularly. We're really proud that this is an issue that everyone sees as a critical need across the state. We feel like this measure is the right first step to get us to where we need to go in terms of affordable housing and free up this funding for communities to access and develop their affordable housing stock. So that's kind of my broad high-level overview. Happy to dig into some more details. I see we have some questions in the chat, so really excited to answer those. First from Julie.
I can jump in here, Josh, if you want.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Please,
I've really tried to get my head around this whole use of the Tabor. And what I'm trying to understand is if there were to be a growth in expenditures such that the funds that would otherwise be in Tabor are now diminished. It's my understanding there's a provision that says if economic forecasts project that revenue will fall below the Tabor cap, the General Assembly may reduce funding. So I was wondering if you could talk about that. And then, sort of, well, if the General Assembly doesn't reduce the funding, sort of what happens? That to me is very murky.
Yeah, thank you, Julie. And that statement is accurate. If the forecast project that revenue to fall below, they can reduce the state or General Assembly will have the opportunity to take a vote to decide if they want to reduce the funding allocation for this. The first caveat to that before I get to the direct response is that we have not seen that happen since the Great Recession in 2008, and the state's kind of surplus of revenue, we feel like does provide an adequate buffer so that we're not going to borrow against, I think, the Tabor cap is what we're projecting at this point. That's what our what our financial team is estimating. And then yes, if the state General Assembly does not decide to reduce the funding allocation, which frankly we don't anticipate they will, that will just be borrowed against the general fund, and will not have the opportunity to debruce until the next hopeful fiscal year when that revenue continues to come in. I think our understanding is that it won't really affect other programs unless the General Assembly decides to reduce funding to some other programs based on their own interests. So it will really go to the General Assembly to kind of decide this, and we feel like that scenario is fairly unlikely. Kathy, I see your hands raised, and I'm happy to go to Mindy next.
Just on this topic, can you talk a little bit about your economic forecasting and how it worked, how you came to that conclusion?
Yeah, I can answer that very generally. I'm not an economist, so unfortunately I can't give you all our formulas and everything, but we've worked with a consulting group, Thrive Economics. A fellow named Luke Teeter has been working very closely with our team. He worked in the governor's office for a number of years as well, and has kind of plugged us in based on the past Tabor refunds and then what state revenues are projected to be in the future. So I would love to get more detailed with you, and I think Kathy, I'm happy to chat offline in terms of like what you are looking for specifically there. But we do kind of have an in-house consultant when we have kind of outsourced these questions, right? Like, hey, does what we're saying make sense in terms of the forecast? We're typically seeing a lot of agreement and concordance. So we feel pretty good about those projections, and economics are really tricky. I think things can really change, but because of the funding mechanism, we feel like this is still really sustainable, even if there is a significant downturn. Mindy, I'll go to you. Yes, Colorado Municipal League was a major endorser last Friday. And if any of y'all know Mike Johnston, our CEO here at Gary, he danced around the office after receiving that endorsement. We were really pumped about them. We've had a few city or mayors across the metro area endorsed this measure. One we're really pumped up about now is Jackie Millay, the mayor from Lone Tree. But we've had a number of other folks from the Metro Mayor's Caucus endorse, and we're requesting their formal endorsement as well. We're well on pace for that. We have not formally received it. And then in terms of formal opposition, we don't have a funded opposition yet, although some of you may have read in the Denver Post early in August, or maybe in the Grand Junction Sentinel. I think there was one also posted in the Gazette recently of op-eds coming out against 123 from the Tabor Foundation. That is the most clear opposition we have. We're reducing the Tabor cap. That reduces the Tabor refunds seen by folks, and they don't like that. So they're coming out against it. At this point, though, we have not seen like a funded opposition. And we are hopeful that that continues. We're always monitoring, but those are the most formal opposition, I guess, we have at this point. Okay, I saw a question about CHFA. CHFA is CHFA, the Colorado Housing and Finance Authority. And so that's the state, it's a non-government entity, essentially, but it is kind of housed or was started by the state, to my understanding, but they work with communities across the state to assist with financing and developing affordable housing. So they're a really well-regarded institution across the state. Folks are like, why are we not giving all of this money to CHFA, which we would love to do, but the Division of Housing has to have some as well. So, Nancy, to answer your question about environment, energy saving resources, water saving resources, those plans or developments are explicitly or environmentally conscious developments are explicitly named in the measure to kind of be prioritized. There's not like a specific tag or requirement on that. It's just generally and vaguely environmentally conscious, which is intentional, but we are hoping that through the rulemaking process, maybe some of those things will become more clear, but we did want to name the significance and make sure there are opportunities to create incentives for environmentally friendly developments. And Betsy, yeah, to answer your question about how municipalities will use these funds, typically, although it doesn't necessarily have to be this way, local municipalities or counties won't actually directly apply for these funds. Those entities will be responsible for the permitting, zoning, approval processes. And so what we're expecting is that affordable housing developments will come up, or developers will come up with a project, begin their process with, the county or municipality where they're looking to build. They'll flag it as an affordable housing project and work with that developer to apply for those funds with the state while that developer is going through the prioritized review process. So although, I said that is how we usually expect it, if the municipality becomes, or the county becomes the primary developer or funder on those projects, they will apply for those funds directly. Julia, can you talk a little bit more about this?
Yeah,
question?
I missed some words in there. I'm sorry about that. I was
no problem.
So I'm on a planning and zoning commission. So I have felt the pain as affordable housing issue or affordable housing proposals are brought forward. They are not easy. And there are always neighborhood concerns,
Sure.
at least in Northern Colorado. So I was looking at the language that talked about to receive funds, local governments must agree to expedite development approvals for affordable housing projects. And how do you square that with land use codes?
Yeah, that's going to be a tricky piece of this. And that's what local boards and county boards will have to kind of reckon with. And I think you bring up just a difficult issue within the way we build in the state. So I don't have a great direct answer for you other than the funding. There is funding set aside in the measure to assist with making sure that that can happen. You know, if a board needs to hire specific staff who can navigate that or design that program or platform, there is funding set aside in the measure to allow communities to do that. I think there are aspects of this too that will be clarified in rulemaking, and so that's one of the things we're really working to cultivate and establish with our current relationships across the state, is like, what are those interests of those organizations in the rulemaking process, and how can we best be a conduit, you know, hopefully when this measure passes, to ensure those things are done smoothly and equitably across the state. So, you know, we, again, happy to chat more offline about what those specific concerns look like for you, and how we can navigate that as this measure moves forward. Yeah, Judy, appreciate your question on rural areas. And I think that's part of the beauty of a measure that is vague like this, and also, or is not vague, but is kind of flexible like this. I think that's also what's hard just about this type of ballot initiative generally, is that we wanted this to really be a carrot model as opposed to a stick model, that we really want to incentivize communities to look to access this funding, that it's readily available. It's in, you know, it's set aside each and every year. It's theirs for the applying, if you will. And we really want folks to access them. But if communities decide not to, you know, meet these requirements, the 3% growth, the prioritized review, and or decide that affordable housing or these developments are not for them, they won't have access to these funds. So it's kind of tricky. I can't guarantee you, hey, we're going to allocate this equitably and do these things, because it really depends on those review boards and what they're looking to do for their community. Yeah, Kathy.
Go ahead and do the chat, and when the chat's over, I'll ask you a question. Thanks.
Great, for sure. Would you repeat the statistics about how many individuals? Yeah, so we're anticipating, Carol, that this 300 million each year will incentivize the development of about 10,000 units per year. And so, yeah, from 2030 to 2040, we expect that to be about 100,000 units. Is this type of measure in effect in any other states? Has it worked there? We have drawn, short answer is no. This is a completely new kind of transformative funding stream, kind of using the Tabor model that not a lot of other states have to our advantage. We have drawn a lot of the language and kind of the funding mechanisms and the areas we're choosing to fund from the affordable housing legislation that was passed in the General Assembly last year from that ARPA funding. So we're kind of using what this state has already created, developed, prioritized, and creating a sustainable funding source instead of a one-time funding source. Yeah, we have not seen this in any other states. I think California, maybe Oregon are trying to do similar things, but these are those measures and legislations are relatively new, so I don't know if we can like assess their level of success at this point. Let's see, Mindy, your question, it won't be necessarily first come, first serve. It'll depend on the rulemaking process and kind of how Division of Housing or CHAFA chooses to prioritize those. The CHAFA process, they're already, they cannot come out and endorse the measure, although we have worked closely with them to develop the measure, and they're already ready with their systems basically for receiving applications, approving applications, doling out funding. Although I haven't seen those directly, I think they've kept those internal. And then, yeah, the prioritization will be done in rulemaking. And so that's one of the things we're working on with organizations, you know, who are more on the Western Slope or mountain communities or represent typically disenfranchised groups like the NAACP to make sure their interests are represented in those processes. And then economic downturn, negative budget. stabilization factor, like with education for this fund? That's a great question, Mindy, and I'm not sure I'm smart enough to answer it. Do you mind coming off mute and elaborating a little bit more?
You bet. I guess I know you're referring to this as a sustainable source of funding,
Right.
but we have several bad years. Is there a danger that
Hmm.
whatever was allocated in 2024 is going to be taken back in 2025?
Sure. I mean, candidly, yes. The General Assembly could decide they don't, you know, if we're having a few bad economic years, they might have to make some hard decisions about how they reallocate the funding. The 60% to CHAFA can be reallocated to other streams. The Division of Housing funding, that 40% cannot. So we'll still continue to see that funding go to that entity. And so, yeah, you know, to be honest, sure, there is definitely a risk there. And we feel like the proper mechanisms are in place, right, for at least the General Assembly to make an informed decision about this. It's not blindly funding this, and there's no opportunity to kind of dam up that funding stream if it's not sustainable or not the highest priority at that moment in time. And we're really fortunate with where we are as a state that we expect those refunds or revenues to continue to stay stable.
Oh, thank you. And you said that the 40% that goes to DOH is not, cannot be touched. And is that what it's also covering homelessness services?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Betsy, can I define affordable housing? I wish I was smart enough to, but I think that's kind of a broad question. The measure specifically kind of determines affordable / attainable housing depending on the type of funding mechanism. Kathy's kind of 4-pager lays that out a lot more clearly as well. But essentially what we're looking at is affordable housing is for folks making a certain percentage of the area median income in their community should not be paying more than 30% of their annual income towards housing. If legislation passes, yes, proposed rules will need to be issued to the public for the public comment. That I think is a statute in for any rulemaking process. The Division of Housing, CHAFA, will need to do those things. What impact will the monies have on people experiencing homelessness, targeted uses, programs? The measure itself remains broad on this, so as communities can determine what those programs or specifically developments need to look like. Essentially, there are no required programs or services that are funded by this measure, nor can they directly be funded by this measure. But what this opens up is opportunities for communities to maybe build those facilities they need to run those programs and free up those monies to fund the programs themselves. Yep. Thank you, Evie. Yeah, great clarity there. Okay, yeah, Kathy.
Yeah, thank you, Joshua. Was wondering if you would go into a little bit more of what the various programs do under this, sort of the housing continuum from preventing homelessness to first generation home buyers, and talk about how we have a lot of people throughout the state and communities throughout the state, how local grassroots organizing might influence local government's decision on how to spend the funds.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. And I think as we kind of talked about specifically with homelessness, but broadly with the entire funding structure of this measure, is that it really is intended for communities to decide what they need. The needs in Denver are different than Grand Junction, are different than Durango, and are different than Pueblo or the Eastern Plains. So what this measure allows is a lot of flexibility in that. When we talk about kind of the homelessness and rental assistance programs, again, kind of depends on what that community needs, but is focused specifically on development, whatever that may look like in those communities. When we talk about land banking, this allows for nonprofits, governments, public agencies to buy and preserve land that will be specifically used for affordable housing and will be required to be used for affordable housing with that funding. And then, yeah, Kathy talked about we talked a little bit about workforce housing development. So there's a concessionary debt and equity capital workflow, and these are just different funding mechanisms for those types of programs. Depending on what the developer looks to do, how much funding they still need to have to develop these projects will determine kind of what the percent of AMI is required for those developments. But when we talk about these developments, these are high density housing developments. These aren't single family homes. These are kind of the beautiful developments that you may have seen that are starting to crop up across the city of Denver that are affordable housing developments, but look like any other community that you may look to live in. One thing we're really excited about too is this piece of the measure creates something called a tenant equity vehicle. And what this is really transformative is that it allows the renters, depending on what they're paying for rent, to pocket some of the revenues into a savings account as a way to accumulate wealth within paying rent. And so typically we talk about the equity that we receive in our homes when we're paying mortgages. This tenant equity vehicle is a really new and transformative concept for folks who are renting that allows them to kind of accumulate some of that wealth as they are renting, that they may be able to apply to purchasing a home, starting a business, sending their children to school. And so that will be a required aspect of certain funding mechanisms within this measure. We talked about pathways to home ownership. I think this will also, support community land trusts that are kind of a vehicle for providing affordable home ownership opportunities to low and middle income families. So what we're seeing is really prioritizing the bottom half of the income scale that the housing market doesn't immediately regulate for or take into consideration in developments. This is where government and our opportunities as state to step in and really fund opportunities for these folks. And then we talked about environmental pieces a little bit earlier, but yes, we do want to kind of develop construction innovation in this measure, and there are funding sources and streams set aside in this measure to really innovate the way that we are building to build more effective and more environmentally conscious high density housing. Awesome. Julie,
what can local grassroots folks do to influence how the money's spent in their community?
Yeah, the number one thing will be, thank you for raising that again, Kathy. I think the number one thing will be, first, let's get this thing passed, right? Let's start to knock on some doors and talk to our email list and make sure they're informed that yes on 1, 2, 3 is just that easy. And then from there, once we get this measure passed, it's about kind of that grassroots movement, talking to your local leaders, your county commissioners, your city councilors, your mayors, and saying, hey, this is something we need in our community, whether it's developing programs to assist folks experiencing homelessness or to building high-density housing or affordable housing for teachers, nurses, firefighters in our community, whether it's building or setting aside land trusts. We don't know what we're going to need in 10 years, but we know we're going to need it, right? And so communicating to those civic leaders in the ways that y'all do so well. So I would recommend that would be priority number one in terms of determining, hey, what is prioritized in my community? And then again, we have the rulemaking process with the Division of Housing that will be up for public comment. And so please monitor that and be prepared to offer your comments and feedback. Julie, yes, thank you for calling out the handouts, and I don't deserve any credit for that. That's all Kathy. She worked tirelessly to do it. We saw this and we were like, holy geez, we needed this 2 months ago. So Kathy gave us 2 months of work in 1 week, and very, very grateful for her on that. Betsy.
Yeah, I was wondering why this measure is involving income tax when I believe there's a large problem with affordable housing due to second homes. And those people, for the most part, are not paying income tax in Colorado.
Yeah, Betsy, I really appreciate you raising that. And yeah, because this isn't a tax increase, this is really a way to, the way we're using the income tax is a way to determine the appropriate amount of funding through inflation, through the ebbs and flows of inflation. And that income tax metric essentially allows the funding to kind of rise and fall as the income levels across the state change. I think to your point, right, a lot of folks, there is a portion of folks who are owning second homes who aren't paying taxes here, who would not be part of that figure, and kind of raise some of the housing prices up in some of the communities where they have those second homes. To that, I would say, those types of developments, again, are part of the market that serves the top half or the top portion of the folks, or of the income folks bring in. What this measure seeks to address is the lower portion of that bracket, of that income level. So yeah, there are going to be a lot of different forces at play here. It doesn't, it's not insignificant what those folks are contributing to the market, but this measure really seeks to, address what folks experience in the market within that lower half of the income spectrum. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Betsy, I see your hand again. If that didn't answer your question, or if you have a follow-up on that.
No, I think maybe I just didn't put it down.
Okay. Well, I do love the hand raise feature and the thumbs up feature emoji in Zoom. I'm stuck on Google Meets all day, so this is way better.
Does anyone else have any questions or things to add? Joshua, is there anything else that you wanted to discuss, or are you?
Yeah, I just want to thank, oh, Maud looks like she has a question.
Oh, I was just going to remind people who came later that the League of Women Voters of Colorado Housing Task Force is meeting October 4th at 6:30. As with this event, register on our website. It's on our calendar, and it's open to League members and interested members of the public as well.
Evie, another good announcement, I hope.
So can you said something about must earn $400,000 a year for something, and then you said $106,000 a year for something. Could you repeat those?
Yes, absolutely. What those were referencing was where we would go as a housing market in the state in 10 years if we don't address this through a measure or a funding mechanism like Prop 123. So those numbers again are by 2020, or excuse me, by 2032. That's a hard year to say. I don't know if y'all tried to do it. 2032. By 2032, we expect the median single family home in the state of Colorado to cost nearly $1.7 million. By that
So
same year.
when you
Oh,
said, so you said that in order to buy the average home now, you have to earn 106,000. Is that correct, what you said?
no, ma'am. Sorry. These are the projections for 2032. And so again, that projection, if we don't address affordable housing with Prop 123, we just let the market continue as it has without any intervention, that median single family home in 2032 will cost $1.7 million. The income someone would have to bring in 2032 would need to be nearly $400,000 a year in order to afford that home.
So what
And
was
then-
the thing for 106,000?
Oh yeah, and that's the last piece is, okay, home ownership isn't the pathway for me. When you look at the rental market, someone to afford the average single, or what is it, afford the median rent in Colorado in 2032, they would have to make $106,000 just to make rent at an average property.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you. Julie, I wish I could take credit for the brilliance of this policy, but if y'all have learned anything in this, I deserve no credit for anything, and it goes to our wonderful policy team. And they did a really outstanding job of working with a lot of different stakeholders, grassroots, and government agencies to develop, I think, a really comprehensive plan here. Chris.
Well, and if I might add, I think the only objection you can have to this is that it's tapping the Tabor funds. So if
Right.
you find that offensive, then you might not like it. But I think this idea of, rather than opening the Tabor funds, bringing forward legislative proposals that if citizens believe they're appropriate, would utilize the funds. I think it's hard to have a problem with that, at least in my own mind. So I'm very hopeful for this proposal.
All right, Julie, we'll get you some talking points and get you in front of a mic soon. Chris.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I have a problem because you send 1.7, $400,000. I mean, you still gonna leave out the homeless then, $400,000 of income?
Oh yeah, Chris, this is those numbers are if we don't do anything, and you're gosh darn right, you know, folks are going to get left behind if we don't do that. So this is just kind of framing the issue, right, as we see it.
I think it's still too high.
Well, again, Chris, these are just projections of if we don't act. This is not a those figures don't come from the plan or come from the measure. These are just estimates of projecting the problem in 2032. So I completely agree with you. It's way too high. We should not have folks, you know, only have folks who make $400,000 able to afford a home. That's ridiculous. And so we need to do something about it. We think this measure is the first right step.
Yeah, because I still don't see this affordable housing. It's still, to me, there is no such thing as affordable housing.
Yeah, I think to a certain extent, you're right that there's a lot of ways to describe this crisis, whether it's affordable housing, attainable housing, equitable housing. So again, I don't want to get too caught up in the semantics of it, but really, I think the thing, Hannah, to your point that I want to leave this group with is, and I think we're, for the most part, in consensus with this, is we need to develop more. There's a lot of opportunity across the state to build homes for folks to live close to their communities or live close to the communities where they work. We need our teachers in our neighborhoods. We need our firefighters in our neighborhoods. We need our nurses in our neighborhoods. And in order to do that, we need to develop the housing that we failed to do for the last 10 years. And so what this measure is proposing to the state of Colorado is let's free up $300 million to help us do that. And we can tackle the spectrum of affordable housing crisis from folks, Chris, like you said, experiencing homelessness, to folks who may have an opportunity to buy a home, but just need that a little extra assistance to put down that down payment and everything in between. So we're really excited about that. We really appreciate the time y'all are giving me today. Maud, your question about yard signs, I don't have them. I will talk to our communications team about it. We have a really pretty logo online. If y'all are interested in developing a yard sign, please let me know. But again, really appreciate y'all, and Hannah, will hand it back to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for participating and asking questions. I really appreciate that. Also, thank you to Joshua, obviously, for this really insightful presentation, and our housing task force who created this presentation. I hope everyone found it informative, insightful, and that you got all your questions answered. If anyone has any questions on other ballot issues, check out vote411.org. And also, too, please keep an eye out on the LWVCO calendar for more ballot issue presentations and candidate forums, because those are being added kind of as we go. We do have a lot coming up here in the next couple of weeks in terms of both candidate forums and ballot issue presentations. Also, for league members, ballot issues will be ready on September 23rd and will be distributed then. I know I've been in contact with a lot of you about that, but if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me. And yeah, thank you everyone for attending tonight. This will be posted to YouTube in the morning, and I'll also send an email out with all of this information and the handouts and such. But yes, thank you all so much for coming, and thank you, Joshua, for an amazing presentation.
Thanks all.
Yeah,
Thank
bye
you,
everyone.
Jeff. Take care. Thank you.